So first of all, hello everyone, and thank you for being here this evening with us. The structure of this event will first be some introductions, then a program reading with Cheryl Marita. She'll be doing some readings, and in between them, we will have time to take any questions and comments from participants. And so if you have technical difficulties, feel free to write your concern in that Q&A box and we'll address it there. If you have any questions or comments, you can raise your hand to be unmuted. You could also write it in that Q&A box and we will address the questions and comments at the appropriate time. Cheryl Marita received her creative writing certificate from Santa Fe Community College in 2019. Cheryl Marita, RN, MA, started writing as a columnist on her high school newspaper, then took a hiatus of 55 years as a hospice nurse and healthcare leader. She lives in northern New Mexico and provides palliative care at a local hospital. Her work is published in the Santa Fe Literary Review and Bosque Rhythms. Touching the Veil, End-of-Life Stories Through the Eyes of a Nurse, holds answers to unspoken questions of today's world. In 15 short stories, Cheryl Marita describes in vivid detail her role as a nurse at the bedside of hospice patients, friends, and family during their last days. Marita shares her own reactions to allow the reader into the dying process, which decades ago was part of everyday life. Join her in her memoir as Marita explores the intimacy of caregiving and of being with the dying. The honesty and intimacy of each story allows the reader to explore their own life, their own inevitable death. Each story brings the reader closer to Marita as she accepts death as part of the human condition, witnesses the compassion of both the dying and their caregivers, and learns how to deal with her own living with dying. Please welcome Cheryl Marita.
Thank you. I'm assuming I'm unmuted, and I'm grateful for everybody from the Santa Fe Library with Jessica and Erica today, and all of you that are on with me. I feel writing a book is somewhat of a lonely venture, and I appreciate the fact that it feels like I'm working with a team today. So I want to also thank my mentors, especially Miriam Sagan and Joan Logie and all my writing buddies in Santa Fe and Espanola, and then all those in the spirit world who I think might be listening to me today, who I've been with when they died. And I'm going to, and for those that don't know me, as Jess said, I've been a nurse for 56 years, and the last 22 years I've been here in Espanola at Presbyterian Espanola Hospital, and I started a palliative care program there 7 years ago. So back in 1964, when I wanted to be a reporter and journalist, I talked to my favorite high school teacher who knew that I needed to support myself. So I had the same choices as all the other young women in my class: secretary, teacher, nurse. And I'm still happy with my choice. And I'm glad that I've been able to still work at 77. My first patient in nursing school died in my arms. She put her hand out to me, and I knew she was having heart problems, but she raised her hand to me, and I took her in my arms, and I couldn't believe it. She died. It was the scariest. I was terrified. It took me years of hospice to really get comfortable with the idea that living with dying is part of how we can make it through our life. So I'm glad that the readers that have talked, the people that have read my book have told me that that the stories have really helped them with living, and that's my focus for today too. I hope that you can have a better not a better appreciation, but to be present and to cherish every moment that we have here on earth. So I'm going to read from 3 different stories, and we'll have some time in between to answer any questions that you have about those specific stories or anything else that you would like to ask me. So the first story is about a farmer and his dog, and it's what all hospice staff know, that the love between the people and their animals is stronger than life and death. The name of the story is He Took the Leap, and it's on page 63 of Touching the Veil. Hospice nurses aren't supposed to be surprised when a patient dies, but there I was, looking at the phone as if it had just attacked me. The phone didn't have to. Matt's voice did. Matt, our most reliable hospice volunteer, was sobbing so hard, all I could hear was, "Harold." I told Matt to get a glass of water and take a deep breath. I needed to compose myself as well. And I'm going to get a drink of water too now. Harold hadn't changed much over the past months while he'd been on hospice. He did have a bad heart after years of breathing problems from farming the dry Colorado soil. His wife Irma and I enjoyed a cup of tea each time I visited, while she told me stories of Butch, their dog, and how he'd arrived as a 2-pound puppy, then never left Harold's side for 17 years. I wondered what had happened to make Matt cry. Cheryl, I should have known. Butch died yesterday. Then Harold told Irma to go to the grocery store tonight. She hasn't been out of his sight for 6 months. She never left the house. But she called me, told me Harold said he'd be fine, while their neighbor Carol took her to buy his favorite cookies. So I came over after dinner, expecting to play rummy with Harold, just like we do every week. He put one card down, looked at me, and died. He died. I got to Harold's a few minutes ahead of Irma. Matt had made sure that Harold looked comfortable in the recliner with his feet up, head back, wrapped lovingly in his favorite tractor quilt, a red quilt Irma made for him to wrap up in the cold days before tractors had cabs. He could have been asleep except for his blue lips and unmoving chest. I sat outside on the porch, glad it was a warm fall night rather than the cold of winter. A few minutes later, Carol drove up and Irma got out of the passenger seat looking confused when she saw me on the porch steps. Irma, sit down for a minute. Why, is Harold asleep? No, not asleep. Irma jumped up, her 80-year-old body flying. Oh my God. She ran inside and threw herself on Harold. Harold, Harold, why? Carol screamed when she came into the living room, so Matt took her outside to let me be with Irma. I knew there wasn't anything I could say to ease her pain. I sat down across the room from Harold in view of Irma. I thought my presence there might support her. After a few minutes, Irma looked at me. Cheryl, did you know? No, Irma, we all thought Harold's heart hadn't changed in the last few months. But Matt put 2 and 2 together. Butch died yesterday, and Harold must have known it was his time. It's possible that Harold didn't want you to see him die. We've had it happen before, but I didn't expect him to die tonight. Irma, Matt, Carol, and I sat in a circle around Harold. Irma held his hand. You know, Cheryl, Harold took to his bed more this last month. He must have been feeling weaker, even though he wouldn't let me tell anyone. He didn't even want you to know. After a few more stories, we helped Irma wash Harold's body while she hummed his favorite song, Fly Me to the Moon. Even though they weren't religious, Irma knew Harold and Butch would be waiting for her in heaven when she died. Matt and Carol hugged Irma and went home. After they left, Irma said she needed me to listen to her. Cheryl, Harold looks so comfortable. This is our last night alone. Can you leave us here and call the mortuary in the morning? Tomorrow, Kenny, our son, will be here along with all of the neighbors. Let me have this one last night. I couldn't think of any reason to not agree, although I always usually called the mortuary soon after a patient died. Irma said she would call me if she changed her mind and wanted me to come back. I hugged her and said, okay, I'll call at 7 and tell them Harold died about midnight. I wouldn't tell them I'd left after he died. I felt like I was abandoning my role, even as Irma thanked me for their last night together. With only a year of hospice experience, I hadn't yet learned about the importance of the time immediately after death and the power of the intimacy it provided to the healing of a loved one's grief. I'll paraphrase the rest of the story. I left about midnight. It was so dark and I was tired. The back roads of northern Colorado looked a lot like the sky and the empty fields, all black. I was used to asking spirits for help, so that night I asked my dad. As I mentioned in my story, he'd driven drunk all of his life and never had an accident, so I figured he'd be a reliable navigator. And I did get home. So Jess, we can take questions now if there are any. And
Yet, but if anyone has any questions, comments, if you'd like to share, just raise your hand and I can unmute you, or write it in the Q&A and I can read it, and Cheryl can answer your questions.
yep.
Cheryl, was it therapeutic for you and something you needed to do for yourself to write these stories about your experience as a hospice nurse?
It was something important for me to do because one of my mentors, in fact, Miriam, had said to me that she said, I don't think you realize that your life is, because of the work you do, your life is different than most people. And so I don't think of it as therapeutic for me as much as I hope that my stories can help bring the reality that while we all die similar to like we live, which is very individual. And for us to be able to witness how people are in their last weeks of life is different, because now the statistics show that while most of us want to die at home, only 30% of us do get to do that. So that's what I'm hoping with the book.
Yeah. Right. We have a few questions here. So Jessica asks, I love the title of your book. Could you speak to how you chose it?
Well, actually, one of my writing buddies, in my writing group, we helped title our books, and she came up with it because of the fact that we talk about the veil as thinning during the fall, and the person that I came up with the title Touching the Veil. A friend of mine that's an artist came up with the idea of all these purple dots as the touching of the different people that I've been with when they died, and the veil as wrapping around us. And so it helped me visualize my life and my stories. So
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Martha asks, how often do people know the end is near?
Well, in hospice, because of the fact that when people sign on to hospice, they know they have weeks or months to live. And as a hospice nurse, our role is to really anticipate and teach families and patients about what might be happening, what to expect. So in the work that I do now in palliative care, what I have found is that most of my patients actually have an inkling or a knowing that that they could be getting worse and dying soon, but they've protected their family from that. So once we can start talking about the real, the hard, and open up to each other, then many people do feel like they know. So
Thank you. Liz asks, does it often happen that pets and their people die around the same time?
it does. Hospice workers are always pretty aware of watching about, if the pets are elderly along with their humans, then we anticipate that one of them is going to go quickly with close to the other. So that love is pretty intense and strong. So
Thank you. Keith writes, is the original, okay, I may pronounce this wrong, sorry. Is the original Bromfield cocktail still used by hospice for pain relief?
now I think now in hospice, the medications are they do use a lot of morphine, but now there are other medications that are more palatable, and actually we can use patches and a lot of different medications that are easier on the tummies and easier with side effects. So
Anne writes, do you think a dying person can decide this is the time to let go?
I've had a lot of patients who seem like they are having a hard time letting go, and we usually try to figure out if everyone that they want to say goodbye to has come into their world, or if there's somebody else, if there's a special event that they wanted to be at. I've helped families have Christmas together in October or March, or, it doesn't, if that's an important holiday, then it's important to celebrate it regardless of whether it's the appropriate time or not. So maybe we should do one more question and then I should read another story.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, this is Carmen. How can I, as an individual person, learn to deal with death, which is imminent? And how have your experience helped us in our individual losses?
That's a big question. And probably what I would say is that learning about what's most important to you and what's important to your family, and being open about talking about your wishes. On March 15th, I'm going to do a presentation at the downtown library. And Jess, I think you had said it's okay to retitle that time to, it's called Healthcare Decisions as We Age. And if you're really interested in exploring your wishes and your families too, and how to talk, I would come to that. I've done it once and it's been well received. And so I would highly recommend it. It's at 10 o'clock, I think. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and read another story.
It's great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I gotta cue it up a little bit here. So the next story is called A Place to Die. And it's on page 149 in my book. It's a long story, so I'm going to fill you in on the first part and then pick up when I take Gail to buy her gourd, which is her urn for her ashes. So the story is about Gail, my partner's sister. After years of living with breast cancer, Gail decided to come to our house to die. Gail was snarky, so life wasn't always easy. She also didn't have any health insurance, so I had to pull in a lot of favors from my friends and coworkers. And she had a lot of rules for us and for how we needed to be, and that made our life intense. So here we are on the way to buy the gourd. The trip to Pier 1 required some planning on my part because Gail had been becoming weaker. I borrowed a wheelchair and made sure that Gail had taken enough morphine and steroids to tolerate the hour drive. Stephanie held the door while I pushed Gail into the store. Her bright yellow skin matched the stripe in her blanket, and she looked like a skeleton sitting in the chair. When a pert young blonde woman with blue eyes and tattooed arms asked, "How can I help you?" I knew it was going to hurt. "I need a black gourd for my ashes. I'm going to be dead in a few days, and these guys are going to cremate me." The tattoos pointed to the back wall. Once home, Gail wanted the gourd on the mantle where she could see it. She put her written advance directive under it. While Gail napped one afternoon, I pulled the envelope out to read. Steph had not seen it before either, which surprised me. Then, as we read the meticulous directives, we both sighed. "Steph, this may take some work." She nodded. We were to ensure that no man touched her body. We were to wrap her in her blanket, transport her to the crematory, put her in the oven, and chant while she burned. I stared at Steph. I'd never heard any requests like this, not in 20 years of hospice in Colorado, California, or Arizona. I doubted our abilities to carry out her wishes. As with other preparations, I called a friend who was a funeral director. "Sure, Cheryl, we've done this before. Van, but don't get stopped. Bring the signed death certificate. You can put her in a cardboard box we have and stay with her until the oven is ready. She'll be on a gurney that slides into the oven. After you push the button, you can stay and watch. We don't do this very often." Gail grinned as I reported my findings to her. She had done her homework. Yep, called around back home and found out it was all legit. "Glad you have so many friends, Cheryl. Knew you could pull this off." With that, she tapped my arm, turned over in bed, and fingered her beads. As Gail moved closer to death, a spiritual healer from our community came to visit. Although we worked together as nurses, I had no idea of the depth of her spiritual work. She hadn't asked to visit, she just arrived at our door. "Cheryl, I'm here to do a healing with Gail and Stephanie. Come into the living room and I will begin." I wasn't used to the healer being in charge, as at work our roles were reversed. Here her presence filled the room, and I quickly followed her command. Gail, in bed all the time now, turned toward the healer as if drawn to a magnet. Stephanie moved a chair next to the bed while the healer, holding one arm of each sister, sat on the floor. The energy in the room swirled as I backed away and sat down. Silence. The fireplace had been blazing. Now only embers flickered. My breathing sped up while the breath of the three women connected together slowed down. An hour passed. No one had moved. Suddenly, Gail yanked her arm away. The spell was broken. The healer's face was pale, and Stephanie rose and walked over to the couch, beckoning me to her side. We went to the River of Souls. Gail wanted me to go with her, but I told her she had to go alone. It was her journey. That's when she pulled away. Steph held out her arm to me. 4 red spots matched the healer's fingertips. Each one burned hot. Gail must have stayed on the cliff above the River of Souls. I imagined her grandparents there calling her, Stephanie there with her on one side, souls flowing through the river, and spirits of family members on the other side beckoning her. Gail never moved in bed, her breathing shallow. Steph and I sat vigil all night. Morning light crawled through the window. We chanted the Heart Sutra constantly, just as Gail had requested in her instructions. At 7 in the evening, Gail took her last breath. Even though her breathing had been shallow, the quiet seemed harsh once she stopped breathing. Gail wanted to be clean, so we bathed her tiny body, dressed her in her denim jumper, made sure her prayer beads were on her arm. Unable to leave her, we lit candles, built the fire up, and dozed on pallets on the floor. The next morning, 2 women friends came over to help us carry Gail to the open van door. We didn't know what to expect, as none of us had ever carried a dead body. She was light and her blanket strong. With Gail settled in the back of the van, I gathered the death certificate, my purse, the blackboard, and climbed in next to her. I didn't want her to be alone. Stephanie drove the speed limit in the right-hand lane. Never before had she ever been so careful. I'd already confirmed our arrival time, and the funeral director had the cardboard casket on the gurney waiting for us outside. He knew he couldn't touch Gail's body, but did help by maneuvering the gurney right up to the van. Gail's body slid smoothly into the shallow casket. He spoke only once. You can push her into the chapel where you can wait until the oven is ready. We won't bother you. With that, the door closed and Steph began chanting the Heart Sutra again. An hour later, the funeral director knocked on the door and leaned a few inches into the chapel. The crematory is ready. You can take her now. Just follow me. He held the door open to the outdoors where the sun blazed through my foggy brain. Just a few feet away, I could see fire through a small glass window on the heavy door of the crematory. One man stood by, opened the door, and motioned us to push Gail through it into the oven. The casket slipped easily in while the heat burst out of the door. Then he closed the door, pointed to the red button, bowed his head, and slipped away. Stephanie took a few seconds, closed her eyes, touched the button, then pushed. Flames curled around the box. We sang Gail's favorite song. Earth I am, fire I am, air and water and spirit I am. Thank you. So before You, before we have any questions, wanted to say that one thing we learned by doing by Gail wearing her prayer beads is that when we got her ashes, because she wanted to be taken to Corpus Christi and spread out on the ocean there, what we found is that in her ashes were little pieces of glass. So we knew that it was Gail. And ever since then, when I talk to people about cremation, I say to put something like silver, a heavy metal, or pieces of glass in too, so you would know for sure that that connection is there, and those are your loved one's ashes. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you for listening too to my stories. I appreciate it all.
Thank you for sharing. So Sherry writes, I've just finished reading your book. I learned so much. I'm wondering if your experience is that nurses and doctors are the main way that patients and families to hospice get referred when it's needed, or do people just know?
I'd say probably in ages gone by, people knew, partly because we aged together in families, and the dying was part of living together. Now I do think it is more of doctors and nurses recommending it at some time. Although many times I think doctors are reticent to begin the discussion. So what I have found is that many times the family has to, kind of open that door to really, doctor, how do you think things are going? So.
Tina writes, did you have patients that continuously asked why they are still here because they may feel they no longer have a purpose?
I think that that is a question that is asked. And usually what I try to do is in those kind of situations to talk about what is important to them and what memories can be happening, what memories we can make together. Lots of times the question that I ask families is, how do you want to remember this time in 5 years? How do you want to remember you during this time in 5 years? And so with this patients too, I might talk to them about, so let's talk about what your legacy is and what you've given to your family, and is there anything undone in that area? So.
Thank you. This is an interesting question I'm curious of too. Keith writes, are psychotropic drugs used by hospice in New Mexico to help ease the psychological fear of the transition to death?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I know they're doing research up in Denver, maybe Boulder, with psychotropics, and out on the East Coast. I honestly don't know the answer today, but I could find out by March 15th, because I have a lot of friends in hospice and I can ask that question.
Well, that would be great. Thank you, Cheryl.
Sure.
This question, oh, sure.
Oh, go ahead. This
question's from an anonymous attendee. I was in a coma after an aneurysm. There were 2 nurses with me within my coma. Have you ever heard anything like that?
Yes. I had, boy, that brings me back to probably one of my first positions as a nurse. I took care of a patient that had been in a motor vehicle accident, and she was in a coma for a few months. This was back in the 70s. And so, the care was a lot different back then. I lost track of her, but she found me and came to my home, and she had written a book about all of her memories from the time that she was in a coma. And she felt like she was underwater a lot because of the bubbling of the oxygen that was prominent, because she was on a ventilator. And then and we had a lot of different suctions and bubbling stuff around her. But she had incorporated so many of the sounds and the touching and the turning and everything that we had to do. She had incorporated into a story that she actually wrote. So yes, I honestly believe that when people are in a coma, they still are sentient human beings and have sensory. So you could have created, I mean, were the nurses exactly the same? Probably not, but they were communicating to you with their touch and sound.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We don't have any more questions at this time, so maybe we have the final reading, and anyone,
Yes.
if you have any questions for Cheryl Marita, please write it in the Q&A and we'll make sure we get to them.
Thank you. That would be wonderful. So I'm gonna find my paper again. So the next story is probably the one that I feel is the hardest one to believe, but it's in mind that I know I was there and I know that it's called Breathless, and it's on page 43 in my book. 30 years ago, my heart opened to a miracle I saw, felt, and witnessed at the bedside of a hospice patient I hardly knew. The cells in my body still hold the immensity of that experience. Not everyone accepts that miracles can happen or even believes in them when they do, but I know what my heart remembers. I just become the director of our hospice. Joan, the wife of the patient that I'm writing about, was the board secretary and literally told me I was being appointed as the new director when our first director retired. So here's a portion of that story. I'd put my head down on my desk, tired of looking at a balance sheet that didn't balance. I craved the bedside nursing that I had relinquished, even while remembering that the whole staff had signed a letter to congratulate me on my promotion. At least they had confidence in me. A knock on the door pulled up my head. Our secretary, Lucy, stood in the doorway sobbing. Cheryl, Joan is on the phone. You need to talk to her now. 2 hours later, I hummed Amazing Grace as I ambled back to the hospice office. My world had transformed in that time. My suit fit better, my shoes more comfortable, my pace slower and more solid. Earlier that morning, Joan's teary voice on the phone yanked me from the spreadsheet. Cheryl, I need you. Bob's dying today. He wants you here. Those words hit hospice nurses hard. They shoved our bodies into urgent actions while we knew we would move to a peaceful, calm composure when we arrived at our patient's home. The spreadsheet on my desk became the bed for Bob's handwritten chart. This was probably 1984. I scanned vital signs, medications, searching for evidence of change. At a staff meeting the day before, Bob's nurse mentioned that he was fairly stable. What had happened? I mulled the question as I jogged 2 blocks to Joan's home. Why would he even ask for me? As I turned the corner to Joan's home, I saw her son, John, looking lost at the door of the home he'd grown up in. John's puffy, red-rimmed eyes stood out in the peaceful scene. Thanks for coming. I don't know what's happening. Mom called us to come this morning. They've been up all night praying, and Dad says it's time. I thought we'd have him longer. He was so happy at his 90th birthday party last week. Wrapping my arms around John's big frame wasn't easy, but his muscles melted into my embrace. Let's go inside and figure this out. Your parents are powerful people. Little did I know how powerful. The living room was crowded with family. Bob lay in his hospital bed, as yellow as the aspen leaves outside the bay window. He was whispering to his youngest daughter, then smiled at me as I came to his bedside. Cheryl, God is ready for me. He said I don't have to suffer anymore. With that, Bob closed his eyes. I looked around the room. Red roses stood silently near his feet. Even that didn't make sense. He loved roses, but the scent had bothered him after chemotherapy. Maybe he was done with his body. Joan's voice was strong, stronger than on the phone. Cheryl, Bob has said goodbye to the kids, and Pastor Raymond prayed with us throughout the night. I placed my nurse's bag on the velvet chair near the door, automatically reaching for my stethoscope. It was my security, always around my neck during decades of work in intensive care. Now the first thing I reached for when I arrived at a patient's home. Raymond's hand was on my arm. Cheryl, you don't need that. You're not in charge. Bob is. Come stand next to me. He'll be okay. As I took his outstretched hand and followed him to the foot of Bob's bed, I stared at my shoes, not knowing what to do or even where to focus. Raymond's church voice boomed out. Gather round. Bob's love will guide us. For years, our church has prayed people into heaven. Today, Bob will lead us. I let go of Raymond's hand. I needed to wipe my wet hands so I could concentrate. I wanted to be present, even though my heart pounded against my blouse. The room quieted after people settled around the bed. Raymond's deeper voice laid me bare. Join hands and we will begin. Mary, the youngest of the children, broke the silence. Her voice quivered, broken by sobs. Mom, Pastor, are you sure that Cheryl shouldn't be checking Dad out? I opened my eyes, wary. I hoped Joan or Raymond could answer. My knees were so wobbly, I clutched Raymond's strong hand to stabilize my body. I had no idea what the right response was to Mary's question. Bob had sounded so sure of his decision when he said God was ready for him. At that point, I knew I didn't know more than Bob, Joan, Raymond, or God. Honestly, I was unsure of everything. Joan's voice assumed the lower, stronger tone of Raymond's. Mary, kids, trust us. Your dad and I have prayed with Pastor Raymond before. We know what to expect. We haven't talked to you about our prayers, but they are ancient and the circle is safe. Raymond didn't say anything as he looked slowly around the circle. gently nodding to each individual as he moved from one to the other. With each nod, the person closed their eyes and took a deep breath. The silence deepened. It pulled me down, slowed my heart. All I could do was breathe. After blessing each child, Raymond nodded to Joan. Her soothing voice brought a small smile to Bob's lips. Children, you're here because of your dad's love. Now let him go with your love. With that, the peace became palpable. Raymond guided us. Place your left hand on Bob and raise your right hand to God. Everything slowed while Raymond continued. It's time, Bob. We breathe with you. We feel your breath in our body as you feel our breath in yours. Raymond took a breath so deep it felt like he sucked the air out of my lungs. For those of us in the circle, close your eyes, breathe with me, with Bob. As I count to 10, Bob's breath will become slower, and on his last breath, his spirit will leave his body and enter heaven. I swallowed hard. I felt like a rock sliding off a cliff. My right hand, reaching high, shook. My eyes flashed open to see Joan, serene, with her hand on Bob's forehead. The children's faces were relaxed. I closed my eyes and began silently chanting a Buddhist prayer to calm myself. May you be free from sorrow. May you never be separated from sacred happiness. May you be free from sorrow. Slowly, Raymond's voice took over my chant. 10, 9, 8, 7. The voice slowed my breath. 6, 5. Still slower, softer. 4, 3. The counting was hardly audible. 2. I opened my eyes. I had to see. Bob's face glowed. 1. I stopped breathing as I saw a wisp rise from Bob's mouth, float to the ceiling, and vanish. Bob lay quiet, not breathing, with a slight smile on his lips. One by one, we lowered our right hands. I held Raymond's hand while others put both their hands on Bob's body. Joan kissed Bob, then smiling, looked at me, her children. Let's pray. The prayer was simple. Thank you, Lord, for sharing Bob with us. Thank you for taking him back into your arms. Joan later told me that Bob wanted me to see their faith and to see the faith that they had in me. So thank you for listening to my story. And that especially is, as you can tell, it's pretty important. Most of us don't get to see miracles, and I feel like that was a miracle for me. So I'd written something in the preface of my book that I wanted to share with you, and then we can have more questions. I carry the spirits of all the families in this book, and I hope I have paid tribute to their souls. Every patient I have been with wondered about the legacy they would leave. Not all use that word, legacy, but they all wanted to be remembered. Sometime I too will die and offer this book as part of my legacy. And I offer this time too. Thank you so much for listening to my stories and sharing this time together.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. It's really powerful writing, Cheryl.
Thank you.
So we'll start Okay, so Donna writes, sorry, I joined late, but wanted to ask if it's common for the attending nurse to hold you back from trying to touch, hug your loved one at the very end while they're taking their very last breaths. The nurse told me not to hug my mother, to let her go, after being in the hospital every minute for 5 days while we waited for her to pass.
There are some people that feel that by hugging or touching, it keeps the person grounded in their body and unable to actually take their last breath and die. There's some there's many articles and books written about the time where we're supposed to give people space. For me, what I've tried to do is to find out what the family's belief systems are and cultures and customs, and then support that. And that's one of the reasons that I love hospice, is that when people are at home, they can be, their rules win. There are no other variables in and in hospitals. You know, we have, hospitals are based on acute care. And so most clinicians in hospitals are not necessarily trained in all of the end of life concepts that hospice workers do. I don't know if this nurse was a hospice nurse or not, but that is a strong belief throughout many of the end of life work, much of the end of life work.
Thank you. We have several thank yous in the Q&A for an excellent reading, and just thank you for sharing. Here's another question. Do you fear death less yourself because of your experiences with witnessing other people's deaths?
I would say yes. I feel my kids were on my first book reading Zoom, and one of the other guests asked them how they were doing with it. And it was interesting. I was visiting my oldest granddaughter over the weekend, and we were watching a movie. I think, you know, it was, I think Elvis is what we were watching. And she stopped the movie and she's like, oh, by the way, that's what they call me. Have we talked about your plans for, you know, what's going to happen to you? Are you going to be cremated or what? And it was like we were talking about dinner. So I was so impressed and shocked. And so I do think that, yes, I'm more comfortable with my death, and I am happy to say I think my kids are too. So.
Okay, this question, have you read the book, The 5 Invitations? There are probably many books similar to yours or The 5 Invitations. Have other books helped you with your ease with death?
Yes. Katie Butler. So the 3 books that I've quoted and love are actually about living with dying as a concept, being mortal, and that's by Atul Gawande. Extreme Measures by Dr. Jessica Zitter, and Katie Butler. Her book is The Art of, I think it's The Art of Dying. I have it here, but I think all of the books that allow us to explore our values around what we expect and how we want to be treated and how we want to embark on the last weeks, on the last years of our life even, because most of us don't want to be on what Dr. Jessica Zitter talks about as the medical conveyor belt. And Katie Butler in her book says, if we could spend the amount of effort and time and money on focusing on the quality of life for the last 5 years of life, instead of trying to cure the incurable, she believes that everybody would be happier and more comfortable. And so those are the books that I've enjoyed.
I'll read a couple more questions and before we wrap up. And there are more thank yous in the Q&A. Okay. Julie writes, so many families do not have or have lost their death rituals. Do you have thoughts on this cultural vacuum?
Yes, I think it's really sad. And I think the whole idea of dying in our culture is, we don't have many rituals around death. We don't even have a way to talk about it. Richard Rohr he's a priest who talks about, he's a phenomenal educator. He's on the web and has daily meditations, but he talks about our life as two different sections. The first half is when we create a vessel to live in, a container, and then the second half is when we live in that container and learn all about our values and wishes and become the elders, the wise elders. And what he says is our culture is really stuck in that first half where we're so busy creating and looking to the future that we never allow ourselves to realize that the second half, where we can even see ourselves leaving the earth, is not possible. So I don't know that that's the right answer, but I do think death rituals that are part of religion and spirituality are very, very healing, both before people pass and then after for the survivors.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. This has been really informative and really powerful, and your writing is wonderful, and it's just that much more powerful with you reading it. So a million times thank you, Cheryl Marita, for providing this program for the community. I invite you all to join us on March 15th at the main library. It'll take place at 11 a.m. And it'll be Healthcare Decisions as We Age with Cheryl Marita. And you can find Touching the Veil, End of Life Stories Through Eyes of a Nurse on the shelves at the library. In Santa Fe at Collected Works, Garcia Street Books, Opposite. In Espanola, you can buy it at Presbyterian Espanola Hospital gift shop. At any bookstore, you can order Touching the Veil through Ingram Spark. Email Cheryl Marita, morselsofmarita@gmail.com for a signed copy. And there's a ton of online vendors that sell the book as well. If you just Google search it, you'll find it for purchase there as well. Oh, thank you all again, and I hope you can join us in person for more information from Cheryl. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. And
thanks so much.
Again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.